Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We are going to turn our attention next to a story. I hope this works. If it doesn't, fair enough, all right? Because I don't know whether you're going to ring it. I think we've been doing this together long enough now for us to know that we can conduct a conversation about pretty much anything in a responsible, a mature, but most importantly, an enlightening fashion. And I've told you the topic that I haven't ever got around to doing because I can't find the right way into it. And this topic is close, but not quite there. What I would like to do is one day have a conversation, because I find the cover-ups and the double standards and the hypocrisy when it comes to child sex abuse that are rife in our society at the moment so heartbreaking and so difficult. My school, by the way, got mentioned at the independent inquiry into child sex abuse this week. They're going to have a special section of that inquiry looking at my school and another Benedictine monastic school in the south of England. So my interest has absolutely nothing to do with that. As you know, my interest is born of presenting this programme and speaking to people who've been ignored for years. And one day I would like to somehow conduct a phone-in in which people who have paedophilic tendencies talk to us about how best they can be countered, because prevention is so much better than cure. For the record, I with the prevailing wind behind me and the right stories in front of me, I can be a fully paid up member of the, chop 'em off school of thought on this one. I'm not by any stretch of the imagination capable of bringing my open-minded liberalism to every single issue, and abusing children is one where I could get right in with the hang 'em and flog 'em brigade. But if you want to actually protect children in future years from this kind of crime and this kind of abuse, one of the ways that you're going to have to do it eventually is by looking into the people that do it and trying to work out how best you can help them not do it. But I'm not ready to have that. I don't know if I ever will be. This is close. Scores of, and this is a phrase I didn't even know had ever become a composite in the English language, lifelike child sex dolls bought online through sites such as Amazon and eBay have been intercepted on their way into the country. They're called love dolls, which is about as gross a misnomer as it's possible to imagine. Manufactured in China and Hong Kong, sold on Amazon, eBay and Alibaba.com, and about 120 alleged offenders have been identified, with charges brought against 7 men, all but one of whom was also found to be in possession of indecent images of children.
So this is the doll. She's approximately 3.5 feet in height. If you were to pick her up, she would be the weight of a 5 to 6 year old child, in my opinion. Normally, this one has a pink wig. They normally come with a pink wig and maybe a more natural colour, say dark wig. They also come with a body stocking or similar clothing, with a nice childlike comb as well. They also have a blanket that they're usually wrapped in or overlaid, with a heating device that can be used to warm up the doll, and a cleaning device as well, a douche.
Noticed an increase in our detections of these childlike sex dolls, and recognising the importance of these in terms of the harm they relate to in the UK, we launched Operation Shiraz, which is led by Border Force and involves all partner agencies in building the intelligence around these importations and enabling investigative bodies to follow up and bring people to court. So to date we've seized 122. There's a whole raft of investigative activity going on behind that, but that's the number Border Force have taken out.
We always believed that the importers of these dolls had a sexual interest in children, and the checks that were made on them would show that they weren't known to law enforcement in the past.
So these were people who'd fallen into the cracks but were child sex offenders already?
Yes, a number of them are known now to have got a sexual interest in children because they possess child abuse material. No, it's not a crime to possess one, but we would obviously work with our Border Force colleagues should we find somebody in possession one to see if they had imported it. So we can't arrest for possession, but we can do some work around that.
Okay. Should it be a crime to possess one?
Yes, it should.
So what would you like to see in terms of legislation to to tighten this area?
Yes, I think it's got to be through the full range of this criminality, from manufacturer to sale to import to possess, the full range. We need to make sure it's future-proofed in case there is the introduction of the sex bots, the sex robots. Yeah, so obviously we need to arrest the importer, get an explanation from him, but we also need to seize devices to prove that importation, and in reviewing those devices, in many cases we've found indecent images of children. That process can take months to complete, and the judicial system as well takes another further time. So this is a steady progress, and we're very much at the early stages of the criminal justice system process. Having sex with one of these dolls would probably normalise that act, and if that person was to be found alone with a child, they would probably go on to commit a child abuse offence.
But if you are possessed of these vile appetites, these proclivities that disgust the rest of society in a way and on a scale that no other crime does, surely a doll is preferable to a real human. And that is my introduction. Call me now and tell me what you think. 03456060973. Okay? That is it. Should these dolls, which are designed for paedophiles, but are dolls, inanimate objects, should it be illegal to buy one? Given that if they don't buy one, then perhaps they will seek to sate their appetites in a considerably more offensive way. Or, I don't know whether it could be argued that this is more likely to accelerate or facilitate the sort of crime that they go. I just don't know. And nor do you, if we're honest, unless, of course, you are a paedophile or possessed of paedophile tendencies and you're prepared to ring in. I'm not expecting that to happen. This is a conversation for the rest of us. Should it be illegal? Should these disgusting dolls, sounding dolls, actually be illegal, or would that possibly make the situation worse? You will get through if you ring in on this. You won't necessarily get on air if you haven't given it a little bit of thought, but you won't find the switchboard jam-packed, I don't think, in the first instance, because, well, you can tell I don't know what to say about it beyond what I've just said. But I'll have another go after this. I don't want to turn it into a competition. That would be a little bit inappropriate. But this has got to be up there with the trickiest questions that I've ever asked you. Certainly, the for me at least, the most profoundly uncomfortable of questions. But I think it would be irresponsible not to ignore it. A 49-year-old father, a nuclear energy expert from Crewe in Cheshire, was sentenced Chester Crown Court last month to 2 years and 8 months in prison for importing a doll and possession of indecent images. His doll, bought via eBay from a Hong Kong supplier, came with a negligee, face mark and blindfold, and it was designed to be as anatomically similar to a real child as the technology allows. And that's the problem. All right, I'm just talking to myself at the moment more than you. I'm justifying my decision to have this conversation. If you don't, these things grow and flourish. If we allow our sensibilities to cloud our conscience, we're so uncomfortable talking about something, we look away, stick our fingers in our ears and close our eyes, then these things get bigger. For example, the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command at the National Crime Agency, Hazel Stewart, has said that it's child sex robots are just around the corner. It's almost a bit brass-eye, isn't it, in its absurdity, these phrases, but there's nothing satirical or comical about this. It's real and it's happening, which is almost the definition of reasons why we should talk about things. It's real and it's happening. I think the loophole is such that you can't be done for owning one, but you can be done for importing one. So it's only if you get caught when it's in transit that you're likely to end up in court. The crime is importing a doll. I just want to know, the NSPCC are unpersuaded by suggestions that the dolls might prevent potential sex offenders from attacking real children. They've called upon the government to criminalise every aspect of the process, manufacturing, distribution, possession, etc. But they are not infallible, the NSPCC, for my money, particularly in the region of mandatory reporting. But let's see what we do. John is in Surrey. John, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. I've been waiting years for you to talk about this subject, because I am one of those people you're describing with the tendencies.
Really? You tell me.
I'm currently seeing a therapist for it. I pay, obviously, a private therapist, so they're not going to do it on the NHS. But I have attraction to young girls, and so I know it's horrible. I hate to say it, but in my view, these sex dolls don't do anything but enable.
Really, it's not going to be an alternative. It's going to be a kind of catalyst.
So to explain it a little bit better, so obviously I'll look and I'll think, and then I'll stop myself because I have a very strong set of morals.
Yes.
So I'm very, very nervous.
I understand you are, and for the record, I think it's brave of you to call me. I really do.
Thank you. But I keep myself level because of my morals, and I don't want. I stop myself fantasizing, etc. But if I had something to act them out on, you might lose control, because obviously I'm very in control of my desires. But if I have a doll to act out on, what's stopping me from losing control, so to speak?
I don't know, and neither do I know whether your experience would hold true right across the spectrum. But you mentioned this notion of control, which I think is absolutely crucial to this conversation, because everybody has appetites. Some people can keep a lid on them, and some people don't try to keep a lid on them, and some people try and fail. You're clearly at the moment squarely in the first category. Can I ask when you realised, when you first...
I was about 14.
But then you were sexually attracted to girls of your own age, or considerably younger?
Considerably younger, prepubescent.
And how do you process that information?
You don't. You sort of... I couldn't tell my parents.
No.
You couldn't tell anyone. And you sort of lock it away, but obviously it's ruined my life, because I hate myself. And I don't understand. I've read lots of reports about paedophiles who are sort of out and out and comfortable with it. I don't understand how you could live this way and not want to kill yourself every day, especially if you've got morals. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mate, every syllable. Absolutely, I understand what you're saying. I'm reeling a little bit, frankly, from the sort of... from the honesty that you're describing, because normally all of these conversations are conducted in the shadows, and you never know whether... you are straight up telling me that you have fantasies about young girls, prepubescent young girls, and you've dedicated your life since the age of 14 to not acting on them. I have to ask whether you ever have.
No, I haven't, no. And I've never looked at indecent images or anything like that, because I know I'd want to, but then I know that my morals tell me that a child's still been harmed in doing that. And I'm only aiding it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Who have you spoken to apart from a therapist?
So I have a couple of friends who know, who are very open-minded, and they support me through. They sort of basically support me when I'm... Because I have very down spells, and I'm very suicidal as it is anyway, but they keep me grounded mentally. My therapist, she's... Can I just say there's a wonderful organisation for anyone that's listening who is like me, called Stop SO. It's an organisation that works with therapists who are willing to work with people like me, because that's the biggest fear that I've had for so long, is if I go to a therapist, the mandatory reporting laws means they can report me, even though I've done nothing wrong. Do you get what I'm saying?
I think so.
So it's a big fear, because I don't know who that therapist is, and I've got to take a big leap of trust and hope they don't report me because they think I might be a danger, even though I might not be.
How does therapy work in this area?
So my therapist at the moment, the goal we're trying to reach is, because she's more worried that I'm a danger to myself.
Yes.
Because of my situation, my self-hatred. So her...
Do you like anything about yourself?
Not much.
Well...
Not much at all, really.
You should probably derive a little pride from the fact that you've never acted on these. So most men listening to this have failed to control their urges, even if they're not as sick and criminal as your urges are. Most men have failed to control their urges at some point in their life, whereas you've managed to keep a lid on yours throughout.
Yeah, sorry. She tells me that something I'm too proud of us, but it's hard.
Yeah.
Because people tell me I'm a good person, you know, I'm very much in control. But when it happens, and it's like when you see a good-looking man or woman in the street, you think, oh, they're good-looking. When that happens for me, it's horrifying, because while it feeds my desires, I'm at the same time I'm like, you're disgusting, you're a monster.
Yes.
So yeah, it's a continuous cycle of that. I'm gonna say her.
So what? Go on. Yeah, go on. What's the goal again, John?
So her goal at the moment is for me to not hate myself so much, but not be too lax, so I'm not it out of control, if that makes sense.
So the self-loathing is a brake upon your behaviour, and she's worried. I mean, you're worried that if you dilute the self-loathing, which would of course reduce the suicidal tendencies, then you might also dilute the self-control. So what you've got, if I've understood you correctly, you are in a position where you can't separate your self-loathing from your self-control.
Yes, because it keeps me. Because I actually tried antidepressants for a while because I was trying to, to make me feel happier with go away. What happened was they worked. I was feeling happy, more positive, but because I hadn't learned or delved into the psyche of understanding why I'm this way, I noticed that as I got happier, I wasn't checking myself as much when I had those thoughts.
Oh God!
So it sounds horrible, but the miserable state keeps me in control.
Yeah, I mean, it's very plausible.
Good for my mental well-being.
Of course it's not, because it is the fact that you hate what is happening in your own mind that stops you from acting on it, but hating what's happening in your own mind makes you hate yourself. What?
And sorry, I just want to say also, I was never abused as a child, so, because obviously I know a lot of people that do harm children were abused as children, so I haven't even, this is apparently just, my therapist is adamant, this is just part of who I am. It's a fault in my brain, so to speak. Is that
how they explain it? It is because I mean the criminality is to do with consent. You can't help who you fancy. Nobody can. What you are cursed with is being attracted to people that are incapable of ever consenting to anything that you might want to do.
Yeah.
What does hope look like in your world, John?
Hope. It doesn't exist for me. I don't hope for anything. I for many years, and I'm still adamant of this, my future is suicide, because I will kill myself if I ever thought I was losing control. I've tried it already, where I thought I was losing control. And my therapist basically wants me to get past that so I can actually have a future, because I don't see a future for myself. I mean, how would I ever have a relationship? And how do I tell a woman this is who I am really? And if I ever had kids, how am I not going to know it's not worth the risk? I might fancy my own children. Sorry, it's a horrible downer on the start of the hour, but...
John, it's one of the most important phone calls I've ever taken. It's one of the most important conversations I've ever had in my life. I find your courage quite breathtaking. And yet I feel, because of the world you inhabit and the feelings you describe, I feel I have to qualify at every corner my absolute disgust at what your fantasies involves. But you sound even more disgusted than I am, and that's what I think everybody listening will be most amazed by is this simultaneous impulse and disgust.
Yeah, and to be fair, they're not wrong for feeling that.
No,
because it is inherently a wrong thing to have happen, and I would full-heartedly support them for feeling that way because it's such an abhorrent crime.
Which you have never committed.
Yes, of course, but it's still the feeling, it's still the emotion, it's still the...
No, I understand, and you must feel filthy all the time. I can't even begin to imagine what it's like, and I hope, I don't know if this is a naive hope, but presumably most men who have feelings like yours manage not to act on them in the same way that most husbands who might occasionally be attracted to someone who's not their wife don't make a pass at every woman they encounter. But for you, because of the criminality and the consent issue, I can't imagine. I don't know how you get out of bed in the mornings, John.
Neither do I sometimes. Honestly, it's. I mean, where was I going to go? If you look at suicide rates in paedophiles, they're astronomically high, because I think people just give up and they end it before they lose control. But it's never known, because you don't know the actual true numbers, because
who's going to put that in their suicide note necessarily? Or whatever, exactly. The message may be. Do you ever have the opportunity to talk to other people in the same position?
There's an online forum called Virtuous Paedophile. It's one where people like me can go and support each other to make sure we don't do anything.
Okay.
I'm personally a little bit on off about it, because there's a couple of the moderators have expressed if it was legal they would do it. Which again is something I still would never do, because I know the damage it would do to a child. So I'm a little bit, but it's somewhat good for just a support network anyway, but I never get too involved.
I can't think of a lonelier path than yours, actually. It just sort of in terms of, the fact that you've even managed to find the organisations that can offer you some sort of help is progress of sorts, but you must be one of the loneliest men on the planet.
I'm a very good liar in life, because I have to be to cover it up. I lie about things to draw attention away for anything from that. I might even give them an inkling that's who I am.
Of course. Of course, so you'll be the front of the queue, presumably in company, saying we should, castrate them all, string them up from the nearest lamppost.
Yeah, because I don't want people to think that I have a smallest iota of sympathy.
No, of course.
The only reason I managed to tell a couple of my friends is because they've seen that documentary, The Paedophile Next Door.
They say that again. You've told a couple of your friends because...
They mentioned that they've seen this documentary called The Paedophile Next Door, which discusses about a man like me.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, they're a bit more open-minded. Maybe I can actually tell them. Because more than anything, I just wanted them to validate me as a human.
I get that. Of course I get that.
You know?
And how did they react?
My first friend that told me, she was silent for about 10 minutes, didn't say a word, and then she just said, I'm so sorry, I can't imagine anything worse.
I'd never seen it from this angle, John. Never seen it from this angle before. Nobody listening has, or next to nobody listening.
It's tough. I mean, I'm not trying to say, it should be right or allowed. I just, if there was such a stigma for trying to get help.
Yeah, well, that as you heard me say, this was the conversation I've never had the courage to try to have, and you've taken the opportunity to ring in and talk about it anyway.
Yeah,
because don't please, no. I mean, it's astonishingly illuminating just to listen to you. But that's the thing, isn't it? Is that if we want to stop people like you from doing things that you want to do on one level but desperately don't want to do on another level, how does keeping everything locked up and in the darkness possibly help anybody? It can't. And yet, I mean, just for you to come forward to a friend, let alone to a journalist or a therapist, I'd say it again, you must be the loneliest man alive. To these friends you've got must be worth their weight in absolute gold.
I would be dead without them. That's a fact. I'm very, very grateful to them.
Well, I for what it's worth, looking at my social media and inbox and things like that, you've done a lot of good just by making this phone call.
Thank you.
No,
I've been waiting years for this.
Well, if you know I'm here if you want to do it again any time at all. Seriously, if it helps you, then do it.
Thank you, James. I've got to go back to work anyway, but thank you very much.
No, so have I. Gosh, 41 minutes after 11, and I'm not going to lie to you, I'm absolutely reeling from the last call that we took from. But let me tell you what you're saying, actually, and I'll read these out more or less unfiltered, by which I mean I'm not going to pick the positive or the negative and give dominance to either. From where I'm sitting, there aren't many of the latter. Fran says, such a brave man. Thanks, James, for that informative conversation. God, understatement of the century. Rick in Tunbridge Wells says, this guy has demonstrated that it's an illness. Let's get to treating it rather than shutting the gate after the horse has bolted. These are broken individuals who need help. Let's stop the fires before they start. All this will help people before they commit this awful crime. Hats off to that man. What courage he has. Let's help him not to fail and not to take his own life. Julie says there are drugs which could lessen sexual desire and response. I'm sure, I mean, with respect, he's looked into, by the sounds of it, everything possible. John in Hoddesdon says you cannot help who you're sexually attracted to. This guy should be proud of himself for not acting on his urges and give himself a break. I do wonder, though, whether he is also attracted to adults. I don't know, John, but I think the problem was that if he gives himself a break, then the demons become louder. Brian in Bishop Stortford says, what an incredible man. That's real courage.
So please have a seat.
Hidden behind a hood, a young man.
Welcome back.
We've called him Anders, and he's a paedophile. Because of the social stigma, we're protecting his identity. In Sweden, men like him can volunteer for treatment. He hasn't yet abused a child.
We didn't choose to be this way. Nobody would choose to be this way, obviously. And yet, nobody accepts us. Everybody hates us. We can't be open with it.
In a world first, doctors are running a scientific study of a drug designed to prevent paedophiles acting on their desires.
Hopefully it will take my mind off these things, or help take my mind off it, so I don't have to be so frustrated and miserable.
This is the Center of Andrology and Sexual Medicine at Karolinska.
Sky News was given exclusive access to the research at Stockholm's Karolinska Institute.
Yeah, so here's the medicine. It is an injectable. You give it once. The effect lasts for 3 or 4 months.
The drug is called Degarelix. It's normally used to treat prostate cancer, but it has the side effect of reducing sexual arousal, just what doctors need when treating paedophilia. Up to now, the drugs used for chemical castration have paradoxically led to a temporary surge in the male sex hormone before levels tail off over a period of weeks. The advantage of this drug is that it works in a slightly different way, causing an immediate and dramatic fall in testosterone levels. That should lower the risk of them harming children, and to track the effect of the drug, they're scanning the brains of paedophiles. This is Anders's scan. When he looks at a computer-generated image of a child, parts of his brain involved in visual processing and arousal are more active. With treatment, doctors hope to normalise brain activity.
We need to shift the focus from what to do when the damage is already done to prevent the sexual abuse to happen in the first place. If we welcome these persons into our clinic, then we need to have something to offer them too in terms of treatment.
In socially progressive Sweden, psychiatrists see paedophilia as a behavioural disorder.
Välkommen till Preventell. Hur kan jag hjälpa dig?
Men are encouraged to call a helpline. They can be referred for psychological and now medical treatment.
Even if we had a death penalty, that wouldn't help, because then there's already a number of people who have been hurt. To really have an impact, we need to prevent new offences.
This problem affects us all.
The doctors have made this video for a crowdfunding website, hoping the public will support their research. In the UK, many people will see it as controversial, none more so than those who've been abused as children.
Children can be abused in various ways, sexually, emotionally, physically. And we've got to look at the whole person, not just deal with one part of their anatomy.
But according to the Swedish researchers, 5% of the adult population has sexual fantasies involving children, and far more needs to be done to prevent them becoming abusers, however hard it is to accept.
When you say pedophile, you think about a child molesting freak, but it's just a word for something that goes on in one person's mind, that he didn't choose, that he can't help.
Thomas Moore, Sky News, Stockholm in Sweden.
If I told you that we were going to have a conversation about paedophilia and that the massive majority of my contributors would be sympathetic towards the paedophile who rang in, you'd have laughed in my face. Obviously, contingent upon that sympathy is the fact that he's never acted upon his urges, but my goodness me, you understand that issue a little better than you did before we heard his call. Helen in Cheshire, this caller is so brave. I feel desperate for his situation. I hope there is a future for him and there is some way of helping him. This has really given me food for thought. I'm in tears here listening to John James. He sounds like such a lovely man. I never thought about it from the way that he thinks. What an amazing call. I don't know what else to say. It's quite incredible. Rob, a coach driver, respect to this man for calling in. And I'm just looking, there isn't a negative. The nearest to a negative, Steve says, that don't forget that he could get himself chemically castrated if he wanted. I don't think that's nasty necessarily, but there's nothing else there. Sarah, speaking for millions of us, here's something. I never thought I could feel sorry for a paedophile. What an astonishing call. Another one unsigned. Although my sexual preferences are normal, I'm addicted to a drug that completely inhibits my libido. There must be medication that John could take that would do the same. A few of you making that point. I don't know. I didn't feel it was my duty or my place to start quizzing him about his pharmaceutical situation. And there you have it. So difficult. One more. I could go on all day, actually. There's so many people getting in touch, and anyone who heard it will know why. Izzy says, wow, I wasn't expecting that. Disgusting and disturbing, but you can't fault John's honesty and, dare I say, bravery for calling you. So difficult to listen to that gentleman and his struggle. What was clear to me was that bringing this into the light and creating a dialogue can only be positive. It's obvious these people need help and assistance to control and monitor themselves so that they can function in our society. This is from Phoenix. So they can, it's obvious that they aren't at present functioning in our society, as they're either acting out their urges or feeling worthless and suicidal. Gosh, what do we do next? We'll just continue the conversation we were going to have, and if anybody else wants to blindside it in that way, then I have to invite you and welcome you to do so. Shall I speak to RJ now? I'll take or shall we do, yeah, RJ's in Birmingham. I'm already late for the travel, RJ, but this hasn't been an ordinary hour by any stretch of the imagination. What made you ring in?
Oh yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm very glad to be on after your last caller. I've been studying forensic psychology, and child sex offenders has been a big part of that. And I've come to an understanding that people in the world genuinely don't know that there are paedophiles out there existing who are beside themselves. People think that paedophiles enjoy what they do, all of them, tarnish them with the same brush, and that is not true, as evidenced by your last caller.
Yeah.
But what I'd like to say regarding these dolls, it's somewhat of an experiment. The hypothesis being, does this reduce people's desires to commit offences on human children, or does this just reinforce paedophiles' ideology that what they're doing is okay, and by outcasting them from society, the only comfort they are able to find is within their own community, who are of course going to reinforce their own ideologies.
In the darkness.
Now this experiment on these dolls is being performed by the paedophiles themselves rather than in a controlled environment by professionals who can monitor what happens.
If you were already prepared to abuse a child, it's unlikely you'd have any interest in this doll, isn't it?
Well, you never know.
No, I know. And also listening to you, I realise it's probably going to be a different diagnosis for every individual. The idea of having a catch-all rule that says illegal or legal. Yeah. John was clear that he didn't think they were a good idea because he put so much effort into silencing the voices, as it were, into suppressing his desires, that this would obviously enhance his desires.
Yes, but that is him.
Yes.
Not
I hear
somebody
you.
else,
I hear
and
you.
his methods may not work for another paedophile who is also beside himself or herself.
It's astonishing, isn't it, how much energy and effort we dedicate to the issue without ever dedicating any at all to people like him. Yeah, or even not even the perpetrator, actually, because I think we do dedicate a lot of attention to perpetrators. I'm thinking of potential perpetrators who haven't yet acted upon their potential. We really should be moving heaven and earth to help them.
Yes, and you've heard the phrase, prevention is better than cure.
Of course.
I mean, for this particular crime, how could that phrase ever be better used? But we don't talk about prevention. We just talk about hounding the perpetrators or the would-be perpetrators and condemning them rather than helping them.
And that is why
they don't deserve help.
No, and they clearly do. And if that call has done anything, it has cast people like him in the role of deserving help, not just needing it. RJ, thank you. It's 11:48, where we are having, or were having, a conversation about the legality or otherwise of lifelike child sex dolls, but instead the conversation has moved slightly unexpectedly into what do you do if you've got these urges. It's a conversation I've been telling you for years I wanted to have on the radio. I'm getting a bit emotional, sorry, because that bloke's been sitting there all these years hearing me say one day I want to have the... Do you know why I wanted to have this conversation on the radio? It's pathetic. Because one of my best friends played a character in Holby City who was exactly like John. Desperately trying to find help. He's an actor, my mate. And it was only by watching that I realised there must be lots of people out there who hate what they are, hate what they feel, and don't know where to turn to get help. And that's the conversation that we've actually ended up having, which is fine by me. 11:52 is the time. David is in Nuneaton. David, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, basically, I'm in a similar position to the guy who called you before. I have the same sort of attractions and drives, but unfortunately I have a little bit less control, and I was arrested about a year ago and taken through the court system for possession of child pornography.
I mean, it's just semantics seem a little bit inadequate in this context, but I'd prefer images of child abuse. But
yeah.
And have you ever abused yourself, or is that the extent of your offending?
How do you mean?
Well, have you ever abused a child yourself, or have you confined?
No. Everyone has red lines. Everyone has things they wouldn't do, and for me, that was it. Just sitting alone on my laptop, looking at these images. I would never harm a child. I would never do anything like that. I
mean, you're conscious that I don't want anybody listening to treat this as a sort of educational exercise. But as a man, who I don't believe any man on the planet has never been tempted by images of sexual activity. I'll say pornography in my case, because that's all legal and adult and consenting. But how do you end up even looking at it? Did you know you had these? Did you know you had these feelings before you saw the images?
It all started when I was 12 and 13 myself. So I was looking at people my own age, and it was kind of that gave me permission to continue. And as I got older, it kind of I knew at the time it was horrendously wrong, and I gave myself permission because it had happened before. I'd never been caught, and it was just the kind of the wrongness was almost a drive. It was like a drug. It was. I know it's not, and as with your previous caller, I've been living with severe depression most of my life. I've been to one therapist after another, and you can't tell them about it because they've got the duty to report if that happens. And there's one organisation in the UK called the Lucy Faithfull Foundation, which I've reached out to a couple of times, and they've not been that helpful. But I would recommend anyone who is in a similar situation to try and do that. But
it's astonishing that a mindset, I don't know what to call it, a mindset, a set of feelings that can wreak such enormous damage on a society pays so little attention to the people possessed of the mindset. And
there's probably hundreds of thousands of people in the country who have got these feelings but never had any sort of way of addressing them, never been caught, never had an opportunity to talk to anyone.
Do you think, does viewing the stuff, because the conversation we were supposed to be having was about dolls, and then it would have led inevitably to images, and the question is a really straightforward one, which is whether or not having this outlet, which images are slightly different because obviously they are photographs and films of abuse and violence, but dolls aren't. Do you think they would help people like you not offend?
I think the only way to not offend is just to distract yourself and to get away from it. Anyone who says that these dolls are a way of kind of managing these feelings is just covering up for things. It's not going to help anyone. It's just going to kind of normalise it, and I think normalising it is the worst thing you can do, really.
How did you get caught, David?
I was. Well, the long story is I ended up accessing a website that was being tracked. I think it's basically how I describe it.
Okay. And then there's a knock on the door, is there?
Yeah, I've been fearing that for 10 years. Every time I heard a knock at the door, I thought, is it a police officer? And then eventually it was, and they came in, and it was terrifying. The eviction caused me to lose my job. My best friend from 30 years has kind of just abandoned me, and kind of just, understandably, if someone had admitted that, I would struggle. But it was, it's completely, it's ruined, but also kind of ruined my life, but also given me a chance to actually explore these feelings in a way where I can actually deal with them constructively.
To start again, as it were. And is that working? Yeah. Presumably part of your sentencing would have involved some form of therapy, or not?
Yeah,
Tell me.
I've been through one of the courses which they put you on, and that's been quite productive, actually. It's been interesting hearing. It's been interesting hearing the stories of there's about 10 of us guys, and in all honesty, they're some of the nicest guys I've met. They've all been through a similar situation. They're all, none of them have actually harmed a child themselves, but it's just, they've all had no way of kind of dealing with this, no way of expressing their feelings, and no way of,
what helps then? So when you say expressing your feelings, you mean being able to say to someone without getting your head kicked in, or whatever it may be, or being able to say to someone, I have these feelings, I hate them as much as you do, but trust me, it's worse to hate them and have them than it is to hate them and not have them.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about reaching for support, and kind of, I'm currently going to a therapist who's really good, who's willing to, after this, is helping me with it. And I mean, there's a shed load of issues it's brought about as well, which
I'm sure
kind of make life difficult. But it's it's so difficult with the stigma that people cannot seek any sort of help.
No, well, you can see why. What did you think when you heard John say that he'd been able to tell two of his very close friends and their relationships have survived?
I'm not, in a sense, I'm surprised he had the courage to do so. But one thing which has been really positive is I've actually been able to continue going to my church after this, and the support I've received from them has been unbelievable. I've been welcomed back as if nothing had happened. And that's probably one of the most positive things in my life, actually, being able to return to a place where people can...
Comfort and company is valuable to all of us, but presumably that involves a presumption of remorse on your part from them.
Yeah, which there's been constant remorse throughout the whole thing. It's just it was a lack of control.
It's important to have these conversations, isn't it? I never really realised until I spoke to you and John how important it must be, because I said to him, you must be the loneliest man on the planet, but of course you are as well.
Yeah, there's thousands of people who are just in such a lonely situation, going about their life and having this little secret gnawing away at their psyche, and just there's nothing you can do about it on your own. I don't know. Yeah,
I think you're very brave.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And I don't know if my little efforts will be worth in the great scheme of things, but I'm not going to forget you or John and the battle you face every single day to resist something that you want to do that you find as abhorrent as we do. I'd never ever thought of it like that before today. The idea that there is only one thing worse than hating paedophiles or paedophilia with a vengeance, and that is having those urges, but recognising, as the massive majority of us do, how vile those urges are. You see, that's the crucial thing. That's why my slightly odd analogy works, with fidelity in the context of a consensual relationship. Everybody fancies other people. When you fall in love, when you get married, when you set up home together, you don't stop being sexually attracted to other people. Nobody does. But you don't act on it. So the massive majority of people who have these tendencies are probably not acting on them, and yet they're not getting any help to keep it that way, and they need help. And I mean... I sometimes forget that we're on the radio. I know that sounds weird, but I've been doing this for so long now, and you've entrusted me with such astonishing insights into your lives and shared stuff that I know you found difficult to share with even family members sometimes, particularly in the field that we're discussing now. But I can't remember anything quite like this. And that's why I've spent years saying to you, one day we'll have a conversation about people who are sexually attracted to children and desperately, desperately don't want to abuse them. Because I just had this inkling all along, oddly born of, as I told you a moment ago, an episode of Holby City starring one of my dearest, oldest friends in precisely this situation. I'd never thought about it before. I don't watch Holby City. I wouldn't have even thought about it then if he hadn't been in it. And yet it would appear that it was an even bigger issue, an even more important conversation than we thought. It's not the conversation that we set out to have. The conversation that we set out to have, though relevant to the broader issue, is slightly different, and that's still on the board. I can't talk about anything else today. I'm sorry if you want me to. I just sometimes feel that we've opened a door so profound that it would be both irresponsible and a little bit pathetic to try to shut it within the confines of a radio programme's furniture. So, listen, I'm James. The phone lines are open. We're having a really weird and incredibly difficult but somehow strangely uplifting conversation, and I'd like you to join in if you want. That's it, okay? The number you need is 0345 606 0973. Craig is in Beaconsfield. Craig, what would you like to say?
Well, goodness. I've been on hold for a little while whilst you had the other three calls.
Oh,
so
blimey.
What I thought about talking about has probably changed at least 2 or 3 times over that period. So I could either go back to your original point in terms of these dolls.
Just talk to me about what you heard and what it did to you.
Well, the thing that it reminded me of most of all is, funny enough, To Kill a Mockingbird, and there's that thing from Atticus Finch where he says, never judge a man until you've walked a mile in his shoes.
Yes, of course.
And I think that's, I quite often talk to people about that because it's one of my favourite quotes, but I don't think it's ever been more apposite than it is in this case. And I think, also made me think of things like 1984 and Thought Crimes, or even Minority Report, the Philip K. Dick book that was made into a film of punishing people for the thoughts that they have, or the crimes they might commit. But yeah, I think John was, it's an odd word to use, but he was kind of amazing, really.
Yeah.
Because when he talked about, one of the most telling things wasn't actually about him. When he referred, for me anyhow, when he referred to the forum that he was on, he said there were a couple of moderators, and they were sort of saying, if I thought I could get away with it, I would do it.
Well, no, that's not quite fair. I mean, goodness knows I'm not. No, he said if it was legal, they would do it. So that's slightly different. It's profoundly different, but it's still grim because, as he said, there's no way that it could or should be legal. He knows the damage it would do, even if it wasn't against the law.
Exactly, and that. So apologies that I misheard.
That's all right.
But that almost then related to what RJ had said, because you see, yesterday you were talking about the word from Countdown of people that speak as if they're experts, but actually they know the square root of nothing about a subject.
Yes.
And I can't remember the word because it was very long and started with ultra or something like that.
Ultra-crepidarian.
That was the one, so yeah, I'll have to try to commit that one to memory. But then, of course, RJ, who was an expert on the subject, or a psychologist, but she said something I thought was really odd, because she said that the people that were buying these dolls were doing them almost as like a scientific study or an experiment to see whether or not your original point of does it sate the desire and therefore it's the lesser of two evils, by a long way the lesser of two evils compared to, physically enacting it with another human being.
Yes.
Or is it suppressing it? And the thing, and I thought, well, what I kind of almost wanted her to say, and I'm not criticising her for saying it, because I mean she's got a damn sight more knowledge on the subject than I have, is, well, actually there are studies, and obviously, like you said yourself, you can't view everyone as the same, but on the whole, the vast majority of people, actually, it would be, sating it and therefore suppressing it, or other people, it would actually be emboldened.
I think it's too soon. I think that was the other point she was making, is it's such a recent development and such a curious phenomenon that there aren't studies yet there might be studies into whether or not seeing images of child sex abuse either encourages or discourages people from seeking to abuse themselves, but there won't be studies into these lifelike dolls yet, because it's such a new
But surely, sorry, it relates to other. Again, another thing that made me think, because this always just spark off little ideas of different things that I've read.
That's what we're here for.
Is that there's in particular in the book of, I think it's Silence of the Lambs. It's one of the Thomas Harris books.
Yeah.
He refers to the young. It might even be Hannibal or whichever one it is. He refers to the young Hannibal Lecter, and he starts off, I think it is, torturing maybe birds, and then small mammals, and then larger mammals, and this is always a gateway to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and obviously he ends up, and obviously that's a fictional character, but I think that Harris researches his books pretty meticulously, and therefore
the psychology has to be plausible, otherwise people won't buy into the world he creates.
Exactly, and so my gut feel, and it can't be anything more than a gut feel because I'm certainly not an expert on the subject, is that the dolls are there, especially because it's been done in such secrecy. It's a thing, it's like, grooming children online or doing stuff like that. It's something that you can order off, Amazon or eBay or wherever in your own home, get delivered to you in like a brown packaging or whatever, and then you can enact it on your own, whereas if it was being done by a therapist or something like that, who was, saying, well, I mean, God, what a grim job that would be. But if it were a therapist trying to deal with people and saying, well, I've got my control group over here and I've got group B over there, and these ones I'm giving these dolls to find out how they get on, and my other group over here I'm not giving the dolls to find out how they get on. That's But even if you had that study and you said in 90% of cases they're ineffective, well, what about the 10% of people for whom actually they would be?
Because if it works in one case,
that's or whatever you would say.
That's one victim saved. Crikey, you have got a lot on your mind, haven't you, Craig?
Well, that's why you're so good at your job, unfortunately, because it's always thought-provoking, whether it's politics or
very little to do with me today. I think all down to John and then David. So I mean, it's uncomfortable though, because if we've learned anything, and I don't know if everyone would agree with this, but I think most people listening would agree that this conversation is a lot more important than any of us realised. But of course what it does is open up other conversations that will be equally or even more uncomfortable, and you've touched on one of those with this. If this is a form of therapy, this doll, then maybe it shouldn't be criminalised. I'm troubled by the fact that almost everybody who's been convicted of importing one was also found, as our caller David was, to have been in possession of images, indecent images of child abuse. So it doesn't, I mean,
I'm highly sceptical of the idea that they're being bought for individual therapeutic. This is how I think I'm going to, lessen my desires. And I think that the two guys that you had who, have these desires were both of that same mindset, that they were saying, no, that wouldn't help me. That would be.
And yet, and of course you can't argue with them, but you can say, if you try to imagine, take your Atticus Finch suggestion and imagine walking a mile in their shoes. If your urges were closer to uncontrollable than perhaps John's are, then you could perhaps conjure up a justification for using a doll in a way that would not in any way damage, endanger or harm any human being.
Well, absolutely. But you see, there was also an interesting thing from what David said, because David said we all have our red lines. Now, to my mind, and God, I don't want to put words into his mouth or anything like that, but someone could surely then say, well, I'm just going to move my red line a little bit because I'm going to buy a doll, but that's okay because it's just an inanimate thing and whatever, and then surely then your red line isn't quite as...
No, and that's the danger, and that is, I think, where the images and the images of child sex abuse, which I don't think it's pedantic of me to insist that we say instead of child pornography, the images of crimes, the films of crimes being committed against children. You say, well, if they're looking at that, at least they're not harming anyone. Well, A, someone's already been harmed, and B, you see someone else doing something that you've managed to prevent yourself from doing in the past, it's surely going to make you more likely to do it, not less likely. I don't know, and that's why, as I've said a few times now, I don't think we're ever going to forget this programme in a hurry. Craig certainly isn't. He's got more food for thought there from being on hold during those calls than I would have thought possible. But I'm the same. I could sit here burbling. I've got nothing meaningful or substantive to say. We're just thinking out loud, and occasionally it's really healthy, actually. Thank you, Craig. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. David is in Edinburgh. David, what would you like to say?
Hello. I'm astonished at your subject this morning, and also astonished that people seem to be so, if you like, forgiving or understanding. I think society can't send out mixed messages.
Understanding of what? People understood what they heard.
Understanding that it seems to be okay that the dolls are not really child abuse. I think, in fact...
I don't think anyone said that with respect. I think everyone said they're a really bad idea.
Well, I think they are a bad idea. Well, obviously, I think they're a bad idea. I mean, if the child pornography is illegal or abuse, and I agree with your term, abuse, then how can having a three-dimensional image be okay?
Well, the simple answer is that it's inanimate. I mean, for example, and I don't want to stretch this analogy too far, but I've never cheated on my wife. If I bought one of those weird dolls from a sex shop and you know, bounced around the bathroom with that for a while, I wouldn't feel that I'd cheated on my wife. So the distinction is pretty clear, isn't it?
I think it's been touched on by some of your other callers, that I think the danger is this is a slippery slope. I think it also reinforces a paedophile's view that it is okay that somehow this
that worries me. That worries me. But if we do the adult equivalent, I don't know if you've heard that Police song I always think of. I think it's halfway through Outlandos d'Amour or Regatta Mondata, where there's a little riff on an inflatable woman, adult, and if you use that, then there's no earthly way anyone would argue that having an inflatable woman is going to make you more likely to have interactions with a real woman. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there?
But that's that I think goes down to the way the person's state of mind. I mean, childhood has to be protected.
No, we know all that. No one's disputing that. But these dolls aren't children. You can't protect a doll.
Well, how did first of all, how did they get moulded? How did they make them? You know,
I think I understand. Yes, they might have measured but then you've got things that you use to practice CPR on, and I mean, I don't know if that's quite the deal closer that it initially appeared to be. And again, I'm with you up on the discomfort about it, but I guess in a way, because we've taken such powerful calls, I also lean towards no, actually let them tell us rather than us tell them. But we've only spoken to two. A 72-year-old former primary school governor and church warden pleaded guilty to importing a child sex doll after a judge at Canterbury Crown Court rejected his claim yesterday that the doll was not obscene. So David Turner of Ramsgate in Kent tried to argue that the doll he'd had delivered was not obscene. Somewhat unhelpfully for his case, he was also found to be in possession of 34,000 images of child abuse. It's 17 minutes after 12. And the question is a remarkable one, really. I didn't even know these things existed, but a few of you are filling me in about robots, sex robots, that are going to be the next chapter in this story. And just like this story, they are, when used by adults, not remotely controversial or problematic. When moulded upon adults, when the robot is an adult and people, for whatever reason, buy one to have sexual relations with, then fine. It's a little bit odd. It makes me feel a little bit sorry for you, frankly, but not in a way that's going to keep me awake at night. But if it's a child, it's the phrase in the front page, I beg your pardon, the first line of the Times newspaper today, scores of lifelike child sex dolls. And it goes on to explain that the loophole means it's a crime to import one, but not to have one. I think I've understood that correctly, which is why all of the convictions have only happened when people have been caught, when the goods, the items have been caught in transit. And then because you know that they're in transit, you go to the home and do a search, is what happened to our caller David, not because of one of these dolls, but because he thinks one of the websites he was accessing was being tracked, was flagging up his interests. And there you go, there you have it. They usually find thousands of images of child sex abuse in the same homes. I don't want you ever to do this, so I'll do it on your behalf. If you look it up, the online searches, you've got, heights and weights contained. One seller offering a doll of a baby. Descriptions including phrases like cute girl. So the idea that online retailers who have these items available to purchase are not committing a crime, it depends on the territory to which they're sent. Well, I don't know. It does seem a little bit outrageous, doesn't it? Until you entertain the possibility that these things prevent people from committing actual crimes. And there is where I bring in a little uncomfortably my sex toy analogy, my inflatable doll analogy. Alison is in Edinburgh. Alison, what would you like to say?
Sure. Hello.
Hi, Alison.
My experience is kind of touches all camps, that I was abused as a child, 2 separate occasions by 2 different people. And my experience growing up was a really deep-seated fear that because I had been abused, that I would then go on to enact out abuse.
You poor thing.
And I think as well, because I've heard a lot of men calling in, I wanted to give what's probably a slightly more obscure version towards it, which is from the female perspective, because I get the feeling that a lot of the people that are persecuted through this, or persecuted through perception, tend to be males, that it's a man that carries that out, whereas equally it can be a female. From my own perspective, I eventually went into therapy when I was in my early 20s. And started talking through all the things that had happened. And after a couple of different therapists, finally came to someone who gave me some really good insight and pointed out that actually, no, someone who is abused when they're younger isn't more likely to abuse. It's actually that, ironically, they're more likely to be abused further when they're older, or to have children that then go on to be abused. But
where did you get the fear from? Was it just because there is the widespread acceptance or belief that often abusees go on to be abusers? Had you just picked it up from the sort of ether, as it were, or was it subtler than that?
I think perhaps it's something where it can be a belief that's held, that people who are abused go on to abuse. Yeah. It's kind of like if you grew up in a family where you're beaten up, you grew up to beat people up. And I took it very personally. I think as well, another element to add into it is that almost by accident in some senses, but because it turned out to be a passion of mine, I ended up working in education. So I work with children constantly, day after day. And so it was something that became a bigger fear the more that I went into that profession. And my counsellor was incredibly helpful. The thing that helped for me is that they pointed out that to become an abuser, you have to go through a series of steps that lead to the point where you come to actually act something out. And that having fought their fears wasn't the same as actually doing something. And I think more importantly as well, I don't know. I mean, it's just simply that. It's the idea that going through those steps to become an abuser. As well, something that became incredibly useful for me, not only in sorting out what had happened to myself as a child, but in realising that my fear was unfounded, is that I was told by my counsellor that people who commit sexual abuse don't do it because they're attracted to somebody necessarily. They actually do it because it's a more subtle way to feel in control or to have power.
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. It's a much more complicated tapestry of reasons than most of the coverage in the media, certainly in the tabloids, allows. So for you then, the doll would be part of those steps, the process of steps that makes offending more likely at every turn, even if people actually and actively believed that it was acting as a form of brake upon their behaviour, the subconscious would actually be accelerating as a result of doing it.
Perhaps. I mean, I guess it's very difficult to imagine what would go through someone's head to lead up to that point. And I know that there's probably parts of the world where it's more acceptable to have a sex doll, and maybe the bridge over into having a child sex doll would be less far as what it might be in this part of the world.
I tell you what, it's an undiscovered country for me, this. Did you know that the adult robots, people are telling me, can be programmed to be resistant? So you can...
Yes, you can imagine that you're raping them.
You knew that?
I could believe that it exists, 100%.
Yeah. Well, I suppose everything under the sun exists, doesn't it? It's just the technology that's catching up with the appetites of humanity. What? I mean, therapy clearly helped you a lot. The biggest part of that help, if I've understood you correctly, was removing the illusion in your mind or the mistake in your mind that there was a cause and effect involved in being abused.
My abusers were the confusing thing for me is my abusers were the same age as me, and they were also the same sex as me. So there was all sorts of many different layers that went into the issues that surrounded what happened to me. A huge amount of shame. And I think that probably the biggest part of going through that therapy process is that it started to unpeel those layers of shame to the point where I can talk about it quite openly with my male partner. Another thing I was afraid of was becoming gay when I didn't believe that I identified with that. So there was a huge amount of issues that went with it that, again, like your other callers, the people who are afraid of perpetrating, they went through their depressive issues, myself as well, being perpetrated upon.
Yes.
Huge, still on antidepressants, although quite happy with my life at the moment. So,
no, I mean, and oddly enough, it can be a symptom of an anxiety disorder. One of the things that people with obsessive-compulsive disorder sometimes obsess about is the fear that they're going to hurt someone or the fear that they're going to abuse a child. So the lines are very blurred between all of the underlying conditions and the actual experiences, aren't they?
And to be fair, again, although standing from the outside and not wanting to just be the person that puts forward an opinion, the thing that kept striking me from your previous callers as well is how similar it almost seemed to an obsessive-compulsive desire, an obsession that would turn into a desire. Again, part of my issue was that I was afraid that my obsession that I might go out to do something with this.
Yes, of course, that becomes crippling in and of itself, and that would probably explain why most of us recoil from these stories initially, but then when we return to them to read the details, we don't understand how someone could have 34,000 images. But of course, if there's an obsessive-compulsive element to the behaviour, that would explain why, wouldn't it?
Indeed, and I believe as well that, again, the idea of control, there's also the element of the idea of the addiction that comes from it, the dopamine high that comes from having these addictions, this, predilection to images of children. And I guess that's probably the point that I would finish by stressing, is that it's not necessarily about the sexual imagery, it's actually about the idea of control and the release of emotion.
Yes, or the exercise of power. And I suspect, although I have no basis for this, but I feel empowered by some of the contributors to the programme. I suspect that the thing you grew up with, the idea that if you were abused, you were more likely to be an abuser, that's probably more linked to the power plays. And I've always thought that one of the reasons for that might be that you're doing it again to try to convince yourself that what was done to you wasn't as bad as you know it was. Because if you do it to somebody else, it helps you create the myth in your own mind that what happened to you wasn't that awful, because look, you've done it to someone else, and the world's still turning. I don't know. I mean, that's me thinking out loud, but I guess I'm allowed to do that occasionally. Thank you, Alison. Thank you so much. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need to call if you want to contribute to this frankly astonishing, unprecedented conversation born of discovery on my part yesterday. I genuinely was having a little snooze with the news on in the background and thought that I'd misheard. Do you ever do that when you've got the radio on in the background and you're sort of coming in and out of consciousness? I genuinely thought I'd misheard, so I sat up and turned the radio up, and it was a case in court yesterday involving a man who had been, or is facing jail now, having pleaded guilty to importing a child sex doll, something that until roughly 4:05 yesterday afternoon, I didn't even know. 5:05 yesterday afternoon, I didn't even know existed. It's 12:30, where we're on something of a journey, not a comfortable one by any stretch of the imagination, and not one we were expecting to be on. I had planned to talk in this hour about either the criminalisation of bosses ordering female members of staff, or male presumably under equality legislation, to wear high heels at work, or this growing, I do have an obsession with property, I don't know why, but I'm increasingly worried about what the future may hold, and the growing prevalence or preference of landlords not to rent to younger tenants, which is doubly troubling, isn't it? Because it means more and more people of an age where they wouldn't have expected to be tenants anymore, i.e. renting a room in a shared house rather than renting their own place or indeed buying. There's so many of them now that landlords can afford to pick and choose and exclude the younger people on the grounds that they are, in general, more likely to indulge in antisocial or damaging behaviour. Then you also had, I've kept it all summer, said to you since I got back, I had a long weekend in France a couple of weeks ago. I had a nightmare with my hire car company, and I said to you, this is a phone-in topic, but it's probably a really boring one. It's probably up there with, have you ever had a parking ticket that was unfair? Give me a ring and tell me all about it. But every day they're trolling me in the newspapers by revealing more and more scandalous behaviour by car hire companies. So far, we haven't had to go down that road, and we certainly won't be going down it today, because I'm going to take calls up until 1 o'clock on the subject of what you do. If you follow me on Twitter, someone has sent a link to, Lindsay has sent a link to This American Life podcast, which tracks a man possessed of paedophilic tendencies who has never acted upon them, but who then sets up a support group for similar people. So it's not the first time that these conversations have ever been had, but it's certainly the first time we've ever had them on this programme, and we're going to continue with it. What do you do with somebody like John, who rang us to describe the fact that he has sexual thoughts, sexual desires for prepubescent girls? He has never acted on them, but finding help. It's a man who wakes up every morning with suicidal thoughts and self-loathing on a scale that the rest of us can barely contemplate, and yet we never acknowledge their existence. And the reason why we're acknowledging their existence today, bizarrely, is because of a story that broke yesterday in court involving a man being convicted of importing a child sex doll. 12:37. Jennifer's on the Wirral. Jennifer, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, Jennifer.
It's just, I have to be aware before I say anything, and I make you aware of, my own bias, and I'm completely unable to extricate my emotions from my logic on this subject.
It's very honest of you.
Just as a mother of 5 children, I do have sympathy for these people, of course I do. I'm human. It must be horrible to have to go through the self-loathing, the cognitive battle every day, not to act on what must be impulses.
Yeah.
Put very simply. However, having said that, these dolls, they are not a good idea. They should not be advocated for in any way as therapy, as a diverting strategy. You made the analogy before with, women blow up dolls, sex dolls kind of thing.
Yes.
And obviously, made the analogy of cheating on your wife. I just don't think. I think it's a false premise.
I think you're probably right, actually, but I'll let you explain why.
Yeah, I just don't think you can extrapolate that then to say, you've got these dolls, the potential consequences of which are children being abused in the most horrific ways.
Yeah.
The potential consequences of sex dolls is my husband cheating on me.
Yeah.
If I take it to the nth degree, the worst potential consequence is of a woman and put myself in that position, being sexually attacked by a man. that's still preferable to me than it happening to one of my children.
Of course it is. All I try to do, and you know this as well as I do, but it's just the closest I can come to imagining what it would be like to be like that would be when you, as a man or as a woman, and you're in a committed relationship that you've pledged to be faithful, whether in a marriage ceremony or something else, and then you fancy someone else and it looks like they fancy you, and you have to slam the brakes on. That's the only analogy I was drawing. But you're right. The extrapolation is where the analogy begins to fall apart.
And I just think, we can't make an analogy because thankfully, we can't imagine that.
No.
We can't imagine it. We don't have an analogy. We don't have the experience or the empathy to be able to imagine that. I'm sympathetic to these men, but I can't empathise with what they're going through, unfortunately.
But you can. You have. I mean, you've empathised with...
I can't put myself in their shoes. I can't... I can imagine if...
You can imagine wanting to do something that you know is wrong.
Not to that degree.
No, but that's a question of degree. It's not a question of imagination. You can imagine doing something that you know is wrong. You can't imagine wanting to do that because it is beyond your imagination. And then you apply what John described as self-control. He described himself as being possessed of particularly high levels of self-control, and you can imagine that as well. But it's such a vile crime that the temptation is almost irresistible to switch off the rational part of our brain and just start shouting and screaming and hurting, isn't it?
Well, it's very difficult not to do that.
Yes, it is.
Very, very
incredibly difficult. But if you want to protect children in the future, we probably have to start trying a little bit harder to do it.
We definitely do. I don't think these dolls are the way that we do that.
No, I think I'm almost certainly going to agree with you on that. But it's been one of those days where, frankly, I don't know who's going to be on the line next. So if anyone is remotely as powerful as some of the callers we've already taken and leading us down in a completely different direction, I'm not going to say at this point that I'm 100% stuck in that view forever, but I completely understand why you think you are, Jennifer. 12:41 is the time. Thank you, everybody, just while I remember, for allowing us to conduct conversations like this in such an astonishingly honest and forthright manner. It's a rare privilege. Ruth is in High Wycombe. Ruth, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I think that I'm a social worker, so I worked in child protection, so I've worked with paedophiles and people who have abused their children. My biggest concern about the dolls is the desensitisation. So I guess it's similar to, we know now that adolescents who grow up watching a lot of pornography become desensitised to kind of sexual acts and things like that. And my concern with these dolls is the desensitisation that happens for the paedophile as they in inverted commas abuse that doll. And I know it's different because it's inanimate, but I worry then about the inanimate reaction or no reaction that doll gives, the desensitisation. And I would love there to be research around, because I think there would be. I think with paedophiles that they would become desensitised to the fact that it's only a doll, and then they could think in their head, well, it was fine with a doll, it's going to be fine. It
feels like incremental steps towards abusing. It's hard to see this, as I wondered at the beginning that it might be, it's hard to see this as a step back from abusing rather than a step towards, isn't it? That's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, so my fear is that it just, desensitises, like pornography desensitises the brain to, normal sexual interaction. And I think it's the same with the kind of blow-up robot dolls that you've also been sort of slightly talking about. I think there must be a desensitisation that happens when those things are used for sexual acts.
Yeah. I mean, it just moves it from the realms of the taboo, doesn't it? I mean, it moves it from the realms of the impossible, or the realms of the unthinkable, the unspeakable, into the realms of the possible.
Yeah. And the fact that doll has no feelings is actually a concern in terms of, somebody who abuses children. That to me is a concern, that there's no movement or no emotions, because you can then start to see children in that way too. And I think that there could be a process that prolific offenders could go through, that they do then start to see children in that kind of inanimate, no feelings sort of light and vision, and that's sort of my biggest concern around the whole doll thing, really.
Yeah, I mean, the argument that seemed to have some legs was the idea that if you were seeking to get hold of one of these dolls, dolls, then it made it unlikely that you were abusing children. If you were abusing children, you wouldn't, I forgive the brutality of my language, you wouldn't need to buy a doll. But that gets trumped by your observation that the doll might actually, although in the temporary it's an alternative to abusing children and it's a preventative to abusing children, it allows you, it encourages you to indulge in behaviour that's a lot closer to abusing a child than you've ever been before.
100%, and I worry about the kind of, I listened to the caller that phoned in, David, I think his name was, saying that he had only watched child abuse online. I worry about when somebody goes from watching abusive images, which is obviously as wrong because there's still a child involved in that being abused. I think, the next step to a physical doll, for me, changes the parameters and the mindset of that. And although child abuse images online, like I said, are still as bad because you've still got a child being abused, I worry about, is that the next step? Will I get this doll, and then does the brain start to go, well, I've got this doll, and it's, it is the next step a child?
It is. I think the word is normal. I just want to read you something from one of my favourite contributors to the programme, Incorrigible FCA, who has shared in the past the facts that he grew up in care and is a survivor of child sex abuse. And he's just tweeted, I know he didn't really want me to continue with this conversation because it's so close to home for him. He's just got in touch while you were talking to say the female callers like this lady have shown the clearest insights on this one. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely to hear. It's interesting when you've worked closely with people who have abused their children. I suppose you come into a greater understanding of the child within that, the adult within that, the family dynamic within that. What that does, how that skews the mindset. And I was incredibly worried at the desensitisation that would happen with these dolls when I first heard you talking about it. And that was sort of my number one concern, really.
And it's beautiful. It's extremely well expressed, and I thank you for it. 12:46. Something else that occurs to me, just glancing at some of the predictably, how can we put this politely, thick as dung comments under the tweet that's already gone out of this call. I suspect some of the people who are responding to it haven't heard the bit where John explained that in order to mask his own proclivities, he would often be among the most violent critics, if you will, condemners of paedophilia. So how do you disguise the fact that you feel this way? Make sure you're at the very front of the queue to tell everybody how disgusting you think it is. It's funny that, isn't it? Have a look at the comments and just ask yourself that question. Why is this person so desperate to be at the front of the queue of saying it's disgusting? Nobody's described it as anything other than disgusting. In fact, the call was so powerful that began this process precisely because it had never really hit home for any of us that you could be possessed of these desires and find them as disgusting and as repellent as everybody else does. You just can't help it. You literally can't help it until you get some help. And if we've learned anything since 11 o'clock this morning, it's that there is not much help out there, which means that we as a society are failing to protect children from people possessed of these desires. But I guess, that's what happens when you start thinking about things. Child sex dolls for sale on eBay and Amazon, and thank you for the umpteenth time for somehow helping me to create a space on the radio where we can have conversations about things like this that are, well, Helen's kind enough to have tweeted thought-provoking, uncomfortable and complex stuff. She adds, I've had to stop working and just sit and listen to today's show. I appreciate that traditionally the radio phone-in format in this country is supposed to be the opposite of thought-provoking, uncomfortable and complex, but thanks to you, we've managed to swim against the tide in the last few years. Of course, people who don't like thinking or indeed complex stuff are going to hate it, but I think we can all live with that, can't we? 12:51 is the time. Carl's in Loughborough. Carl, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi, James. Well, it's a bit like what a lady said before me. Well, you said earlier that, these sex dolls could perhaps maybe act as a deterrent for sexual abuse, but I'd actually argue that maybe it could lead to maybe the normalisation of sex.
Yes, I think you're probably right.
If it's okay to have sex with a child doll, then I think that should tell society that this mindset is not actually too dissimilar of that of a paedophile.
Well, only a paedophile is going to want to have sex with a lifelike child sex doll.
Yes.
No one else is.
Exactly. But I think one analogy of using it is that vaping.
Oh, come on, are you serious?
No. Vaping quite often leads to smoking tobacco. And I think it's that kind of step that you spoke of earlier, that one thing can lead to another. Like, it's a progressive thing. People tend to start off with something less severe, almost like a gateway drug, and I think that's
listen, this isn't a conversation where we're going to have, unless of course anyone rings in to defend the sort of behaviour we've been discussing, in which case I'll tear them apart with my bare hands. But I'm not going to have an argument with you. I don't think the vaping parallel necessarily works. I understand what you mean about the doll being a step towards the criminality, but in terms of why someone would try to get a doll, I can't really conceive of circumstances in which they were trying to indulge their appetites without abusing a child. Why on earth else would you get hold of one of these dolls? It just isn't going to work. In the long run, it's going to make their condition worse, and it's going to make their likelihood of offending greater, even if they think at the time of ordering it that it is going to make their likelihood of offending lesser, I think. But I don't know if vaping quite fits. Is it even true that vaping makes you more likely to take up proper smoking?
Yes. Well,
is it? Fair enough.
I think that is true. But I think the answer, as you were saying, is actually counselling, not a sex doll. And I think that's how we could sort out this kind of problem once and for all, is by counselling, not actually providing something that could, actually lead to it happening to real people.
Well, that's the most amazing thing, really, isn't it? That you learn when you have conversations like this, is that we have, there's a tweet that puts it brilliantly. Lee says, "You've woken a sleeping giant. We spend our time disgusted with the perpetrator and not enough with people carrying this issue." So people who don't want to be perpetrators but know from the contents of their deepest, darkest soul, they know that they are likely to be a perpetrator one day, or they know that they are possessed of whatever it is that turns people into a perpetrator. They have the same desires, and yet if anybody ever told you that, what would you do now? How old are you? You sound young.
Well, I'm 17.
What would you do if a mate of yours told you that he was attracted to prepubescent boys or girls? How would you react?
Oh, well, I'd be absolutely disgusted, and it's actually, I think, for someone quite young, and I think maybe for people that maybe feel quite vulnerable to this kind of thing, it's actually quite a disturbing thought.
Yes.
That anybody would be interested in things like this, and I think that's why it's a good thing to actually talk about instead of keeping it as a taboo topic. I think it's important that we discuss it and address what kind of...
Because you want to protect children. The only people who don't want to have these conversations and try to help these people not abuse are people who don't want to prevent children from being abused. You need to take a really long, hard look at yourself if you've listened to an hour and 55 minutes of this conversation and not realised that there are only two sides to it. People who want to stop children being abused, people who want to absolutely maximise the possibility of preventing abuse, which means you go to the people likely to commit abuse and try to find out what you can do to stop it from happening. Sometimes a little bit baffled that this stuff needs to be explained out loud, but apparently it does. And the other side, where why on earth would we do anything to try and stop people abusing children? Oh, it's disgusting, flipping lefty. I've just seen one tweet saying that the left wing have been trying to normalise paedophilia since the 1970s. And you sit there, even with my box of trolls, which is absolutely vintage, I genuinely believe, I know I can be a bit boastful sometimes, but if anyone's got a madder box of trolls than me, I will give them the money myself. So even by my standards of trolling, somebody listening to what you've just heard and deciding that a suitable response is to say, the lefties have been trying to normalise paedophilia since the 70s. It's quite incredible. Until, of course, you bear in mind that observation that John made, that sometimes the loudest, least thoughtful voices of condemnation will be coming from people who are desperate to cover up their own proclivities. 12:56 is the time. Toby is in Didcot. Toby, what would you like to say?
Hi, just checking you can hear me okay. Reception might not be great.
Well, it's not great, actually, but carry on. Let's see how we get on.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, first of all, one of the really important things is to make sure that we don't define people purely by their sexuality. And I think that John and David, they made all the points against sexual dolls, etc. So I'll leave that part there. But I think it is important as a society that we decide what is right, what is wrong, and what is perverted and what.
I don't think anyone needs any help deciding what's right and wrong when it comes to abusing children, Toby. Unless I'm misunderstanding you, it is just wrong. Even some people that want to do it recognise that it's wrong, and it's them that we're talking about today. Valerie's in Spain. Valerie, what would you like to say?
I just wanted to say quickly, James, that as a person who's worked with incest survivors in the past and seen the enormous damage which is done to the children right into their adulthood and middle years, absolutely horrendous. I haven't time to describe it all to you, but I do feel that the kind of sensitive men who desperately want to conquer their urges would be helped in therapy by acquainting them first hand, possibly, with this kind of damage. It is just so awful, and I can't believe that those men who want to resist the urge, having seen what can be done,
they would be helped by knowing the possible ramifications of their behaviour. It's a very good point. I don't know what goes on in these therapy situations, and I also don't know whether there would be many survivors queuing up to help other potential offenders not becoming offenders. But it's an interesting angle that you bring, and that's it for today. Do you know, I'm supposed to be writing a newspaper column this afternoon. I'm not going to be able to. I'm absolutely battered. I'm all over the place. I really am. I feel that my brain and my heart have been treated like footballs over the course of the last 2 hours. But goodness me, imagine waking up every single day feeling like John does and David does. That's it from me for another day. We'll do it again tomorrow morning from 10. You have been listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The next voice you will hear belongs to Shelagh Fogarty.
Hello there, good afternoon. Probably a bit of a health warning on this hour, given that it's the summer holidays now, and if there are children near the radio, you might want to just pay attention and decide for yourself whether you want them to continue listening to the conversation. It was prompted in me anyway by listening to James's programme earlier on, when he began by discussing these childlike sex dolls that are imported quite simply into this country, and whether we should have regulation around the importation of such things. And it prompted some extraordinary calls, actually, to James's show on the question of attraction to children. We'll hear one of those calls in just a second, or part of it anyway. And while you're listening to it, David, who called into James's programme, explaining his attraction to children, ask yourself whether we need to listen more carefully to men like him, to people like him, whether we need to take more time to understand adult attraction to children, not to accept it, not to take it lightly, not to decide it's okay, or acting on it is okay, but should we take the time to try to understand it in perhaps less simple terms? 0345 6060 973, the number to call. You can text 84850 or tweet at LBC. Let's have a listen to what David had to say when he rang in earlier.
I was arrested about a year ago and taken through the court system for possession of child pornography.
I mean, just semantics seem a little bit inadequate in this context, but I'd prefer images of child abuse. But
yeah.
Have you ever abused yourself, or is that the extent of your offending?
How do you mean?
Well, have you ever abused a child yourself, or have you confined?
No. Everyone has red lines. Everyone has things they wouldn't do, and for me, that was it. Just sitting alone on my laptop, looking at these images. I would never harm a child. I would never do anything like that. It all started when I was 12 and 13 myself, so I was looking at people my own age, and
yes.
It was that gave me permission to continue. And as I got older, I knew at the time it was horrendously wrong, and the wrongness was almost a drive. It was like a drug. It was I know it's not. And as with your previous caller, I've been living with severe depression most of my life. I've been to one therapist after another, and you can't tell them about it because they've got the duty to report it. And there's probably hundreds of thousands of people in the country who have got these feelings but never had any sort of way of addressing them. Never been caught. Never had an opportunity to talk to anyone.
Do you think does viewing the stuff? Do you think they would help people like you not offend?
I think the only way to not offend is just to distract yourself and to get away from it. Anyone who says that these dolls are a way of kind of managing these feelings is just covering up for things. It's not going to help anyone. It's just going to kind of normalise it, and I think normalising it is the worst thing you can do, really. Every time I heard a knock at the door, I thought, is it a police officer? And then eventually it was, and they came in, and Yeah, it was terrifying. The actual conviction caused me to lose my job. My best friend from 30 years has kind of just abandoned me, and kind of just, understandably, if someone had admitted that, I would struggle. But it was, it's been completely, it's ruined, but also kind of ruined my life, but also given me a chance to actually explore these feelings in a way where I can actually deal with them constructively. I've been through one of the courses which they put you on, and that's been quite productive, actually. It's interesting hearing. It's interesting hearing stories of the other. There's about 10 of us guys, and in all honesty, they're some of the nicest guys I've met. They've all been through a similar situation. They're all. None of them have actually harmed a child themselves, but it's just they've all had no way of kind of dealing with this, no way of expressing their feelings, and no way of.
What helps then? So when you say expressing your feelings, you mean being able to say to someone without getting your head kicked in or whatever it may be, or alienate, being able to say to someone, I have these feelings, I hate them as much as you do, but trust me, it's worse to hate them and have them than it is to hate them and not have them.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about reaching for support and kind of. I mean, I'm currently going to a therapist who's really good, who's willing to. After this, is helping me with it, and I mean, there's a shed load of issues it's brought about as well, which kind of makes life difficult. But it's it's so difficult with the stigma that people cannot seek any sort of help.
Well, that was David in Nuneaton speaking to James O'Brien earlier on his programme on LBC. And I'm going to tread extremely carefully here because I can already see, a bit like the NHS Hour actually, where people misunderstand my intention, I think, in the conversation. Some people are already saying you feel let down both by me and by James for even addressing any complexity in paedophilic feeling. Let's just get a couple of things straight before we start. Having sex with children is always wrong. Having sex with children is always abusive if you are an adult. And having sex with children should always lead to some kind of punishment. We'll come on to therapy in a second. So can I just get those three things out there? It is wrong. It is a crime. It deserves punishment to sexually abuse a child. What I'm talking about is the fact that adults sometimes are attracted to children. What do we do with that fact? Because again, a bit like the NHS, if we ignore what's wrong, we just leave it to grow, we leave it to fester, we leave it to become something that's just festering in an individual or festering in our society. So there is no point in doing that, no point in doing that whatsoever. Juliet Grayson calls me, chair of STOPSO, Specialist Treatment Organisation for the Prevention of Sexual Offending. Juliet, you must have listened with great relief as David described the therapies that he is receiving proving useful to him.
Absolutely, and it's what we're hearing all the time, is people who are absolutely desperate for help and they don't know where to turn to. And as he said, if they carry on acting out, that's the worst thing that can happen because, you know, children are harmed even through child abuse images. He's not committed a contact offence, but it's still illegal and there are still children who are impacted by that. So, and at STOPSO, what we have done is set up a network of therapists all across the UK so that people know they will go to someone who is open to working with them and who won't judge them and who will help them to stop sexually harmful behaviour.
The psychologist Oliver James, I don't know whether you're familiar with the things that he's written on this. He's a clinical psychologist, and I was reminded of him. I was hoping he would be able to come on, but he wasn't able to. I was reminded of him when I heard David's call about attraction to children. And I've got a little section of a piece he wrote about it a while ago where he talked about remove sexuality from it for a moment, just that the appeal that children have to adults. Children are hugely appealing to adults for evolutionary reasons, for reasons that make us stick around and take care of them and raise them. But that can become confused in people, and that is what David seemed to be saying.
And there's a chap called James Cantor who's done research on the brains of paedophiles. And what he's found is that their brains are literally different, and that when they see a child, what gets lit up in their brain is the sexual part of the brain, whereas we might look at a child and our empathy is lit up. For them, it's the sexual part.
But there is something very sensual. I never know whether it's sensuous or sensual about children, isn't it? The way they behave, their beauty, the way they engage with the world, and again, that shouldn't be confused with sexual. It's a very different thing to admire, isn't it, in a person?
Absolutely, two completely separate things, but some people do get that confused. So if you are someone who's sexually attracted to children, and James Cantor talks about that as a sexual orientation in the way of heterosexuality or homosexuality. If you have that sexual attraction, then what can happen is they get what in the jargon is called cognitive distortion, which means that they read the normal sensuous signs that a child gives of pleasure and wanting contact. They misread that as wanting sexual contact, and they justify it in their minds as being okay. And that's where we can help with therapy, by really helping them to make the distinction and clarify that actually it's not normal for an adult to respond sexually to a child, and it's a child has the complete freedom, should have the complete freedom to be a sensual being with any adult in their vicinity,
without that placing them in danger,
without it being misused. Absolutely, it's the adult's responsibility to hold the boundary. And 14-year-old children will be quite seductive and can be, but that's part of the learning, that's part of their normal healthy development, and it's our responsibility as the adults to hold the line and be very clear about where that line is.
And when people, and I can see people messaging to this effect already, when people say that the conversation we are having should never be had in terms of sexual preference, because it normalizes it, it makes it some kind of acceptable thing. What do you say to that, Juliet?
Well, that's all fine and dandy, and people say let's string them up by their testicles and all the rest of it, but that's fine until it's your child. And we have an online questionnaire at StopSo which asks, at what age did you first know you had a problem with your sexual thinking or your sexual behaviour? And 51% know by the time they're 16 years old, and that was indicated in the interview you just showed as well. And a further 21% know by the time they're 25. So 72% of people know by the time they're 25 years old that they've got a problem with their sexual thinking or their sexual behaviour. And if we can catch them early before they've acted out, we can give them help, and then they never need to go on to become a child molester. And that's where society needs to have these conversations. I think what you're doing is marvellous, because we need to talk about this, we need to debate it, we need to inquire further into it, so that we can protect children at the end of the day. That's what this is all about.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Good to talk to you. Juliet Grayson, Chair of StopSo. She mentioned the gentleman who'd carried out different research to hers, James Cantor, and we'll speak to him just after the break, the psychologist James Cantor. Keep your calls coming on this as well. Should we take the time to understand adult attraction to children, perhaps more than we do, in less black and white terms than we do? Should we take time to understand adult attraction to children more than we do? It doesn't always amount to sexual abuse of children. We heard from David, the caller who rang James's programme earlier on, and we spoke to Juliet Grayson as well, who chair of an organisation that aims to stop sexual offending by treating people who are attracted to children. She mentioned James Cantor, a psychologist who's explored the neuroscience in all of this, how the brain looks and how the brain works when it comes to attraction to children, and he joins us now. Good afternoon to you, James.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for coming on here at such short notice. To those people, and I can see them already calling in, to those people who say even discussing sexual attraction to children in these terms is a betrayal of people who are sexually abused, what do you say to that?
Well, I can never speak in anybody else's stead, but the feedback that I get from people who were themselves abused is one of gratitude. Most people generally realize that if we knew more about pedophilia and how to prevent it, then they might not be victims. Most of the emotion that comes forth when we talk about these issues is perfectly understandable. People are angry, people are fearful. But if we take a deep breath and think about it for a second, everything we're trying to bring to bear is about revenge and is about trying to prevent there being another offense from the same person. But if we were able to get resources to these people to talk to them before their first offense, then we wouldn't have a victim in the equation at all.
Is it the same as any other sexual orientation? And by that I mean, is it a sexual orientation?
As best as we can determine, it seems to be. I hesitate to use the phrase only because different people use that phrase to mean different things. Some people say that sexual orientation, by their definition, means attraction to men versus women, and because there's such a long, unfortunate history and stereotype about gay men preying upon children, I do want to hesitate using the same word. But those are all, although I agree with them, they are political considerations. If we're talking about from a pure scientific end, by that, in that area, we mean sexual orientation to be something that someone is born with and cannot change. By that definition, yes, pedophilia is, again, something we appear to be born with, or one appears to be born with, and is something that cannot be changed over life. The best that we can do is help the person manage their sexual interest in as healthy a way as possible.
And obviously, we've heard from David and others that treatment, psychological treatment, has helped them to manage this sexual preference of theirs. Can you imagine a time down the line when attraction to children could be treated neurologically with drugs? I mean, I know that castration has been tried, but I'm not particularly talking about that.
Right. Castration and the related interventions are really just about taking out somebody's sex drive, and it would work the same regardless of what it is that they're sexually interested in. To turn a pedophile into a non-pedophile, that's much tougher. There doesn't seem to be anything that we know about how the brain works and how the brain works in pedophilia. It doesn't suggest something simple where we could change a fiber or take out some part of bad tissue or add a pill. Nothing we've discovered suggests that kind of an intervention. The most likely things we are to see is early detection, so we can intervene early, or if we can figure out the first chain of chemical events which appear to be early in pregnancy. So the earliest detectable things we found occur somewhere early in the first trimester, late in the second trimester. So I think the much more likely places for us to intervene will be in that part of pregnancy, which will decrease, I will predict, not just the probability of pedophilia, but the probability of several other things that are also going on. Pedophilia is just the one that we notice the most because it is potentially dangerous to other people.
And it's interesting, even as you say that, you're describing there a situation that is so, well, as things stand anyway, so set if you're talking about the first 3 months in the womb. But can you really envisage a situation where an intervention at that stage could at least go some way to insulating someone against developing those feelings? Do you think that's possible?
Possible, yes. My gut reaction, and we're now, pretty in much more of a science fiction range than anything else. I think that we will more likely see the environment in which the woman is carrying the child is really interacting with the pregnancy itself. I'm referring to things like prenatal stress, poor nutrition, an unstable environment. Those kinds of stresses do, severely change what's going on in the chemical soup in which the fetus is developing. And the most likely outcome of this is the better care that we can get to mothers, the less likely anything is going to go wrong in the womb, including the development of pedophilia.
Stay with us if you would, Professor Cantor, because I want to bring in Gary here, Gary in Woolwich. Gary, your call struck me straight away when I saw the detail of it, because you say you feel betrayed by me and by James O'Brien for talking about this in this way. Tell me why.
No, not for talking about it, Sheila, that's fair enough, but the whole message that I'm getting today is some sort of understanding about the actual paedophile. Well, I'd like somebody, I know that you've already warned mums and dads about children in the cars and everything, but I'd like somebody to just explain to me, because I've been trying to do it for 40 years. There was 2 social workers, it's okay, the case is all dealt with and everything, I won the case. There was 2 social workers that had both been on courses about children, about how to treat children and everything. One of them, Sheila, he took me to a hotel when I was 11 years old and he raped me. The other one pretended to be like a father figure that I never had. I've spent over 40 years trying to understand these things. There is no understanding, Sheila. Sheila, to be honest, I had a lot of criminal ways when I was younger. No judge has ever tried to understand me for what I've done. I just tried to understand myself. I've been in and out of prison a few times, not for a long, long time. I'm reformed now. But nobody ever tried to understand me and the fact that I was a thief or a robber or whatever. And yet we want to understand people that have done, are actually... Okay, so what about the one you get wrong? The one you get wrong is going to end up like me in 40 years' time. The one that they get wrong with the understanding, Sheila.
I understand. I completely understand your anger and your distress about it, Gary. What I would say is my motivation, and James Cantor can tell me his motivation in a moment. My motivation for having this conversation and the motivation to understand these impulses, to understand this kind of attraction, is so that it can be better managed. No, you're not going to manage it out, probably, of humanity any more than you're going to manage heterosexuality out of humanity. But, forewarned is forearmed. I mean, James Cantor, what's your motivation?
Well, the best metaphor I have is that, from where I'm sitting, is that if I were a physician in an emergency room, for example, there was a terrible car accident and the whole family is brought in, teetering on the brink of death. It would be perfectly natural for anybody looking at that situation and be aghast in horror. But if the surgeon allows him or herself to engage in those emotions, the surgeon can't help the family. The only thing that that those of us who entered these situations, and again, not the people who were directly involved, the emotions are, of course, what human emotions are. But as a professional, we need a certain amount of distance to be able to take a step back and look at the situation rationally in order to know what to do. Otherwise, we can't be any help. That doesn't mean anybody's emotions are wrong about the situation. If I were a victim of this kind of a situation, I would probably have those emotions myself. But that doesn't mean that my beliefs are correct. The beliefs that are most likely to lead us to a way to prevent more of these situations is to take that, however many steps we need in order to be able to look at the situation dispassionately.
Thank you very much indeed, James Cantor, psychologist, exploring the neuroscience of all of this, of attraction to children. And Gary, in Woolwich, do you understand there that James Cantor, and indeed myself in prompting this conversation, understanding things almost always protects you from the worst effects, doesn't it?
It does. It can do, Sheila, to be honest. Believe me, I know that your heart is in the right place, Sheila, and I know that James O'Brien, as much as we disagree on things, I know his heart is in the right place. But if I've got my grandchildren and there's a couple of people about, am I going to make sure, or am I going to try and understand one of them? I'm not going to try and understand one of them, Sheila. I'm going to make sure that my grandchildren are okay and nothing is going to happen to them. I don't know exactly how, when we've got a care system and everything else, Sheila. I've got no proper answers. But all I'm saying is it does sound today like LBC, not LBC, but yourself, God bless you, and James O'Brien earlier, it does sound like there's a little bit creeping in about understanding paedophilia. And obviously, I don't think I'm ever going to turn that page.
But Gary, you can attempt to understand something and still reject what it is, can't you?
Yeah, I think obviously there's a lot of emotion been running about today, Sheila, and I'm starting to calm down. And so thankful to LBC for letting me come on.
Well, any time, Gary, it's yours.
Thank you. I can understand that we want to sort these problems out, and I know that you've got some lovely ways about you, and so has James O'Brien, to be honest, as well. But I just think on this one, I'm failing to see how we're gonna solve the problem by trying to understand it, Sheila.
All right, Gary.
I hope there is an answer.
I do too. Thank you, Gary in Woolwich. Understandably, kind of upset and unsettled by the conversation, but it seems to me that in the understanding, if professionals like Juliet Grayson, like James Cantor, not me, not Gary, but professionals can intervene in the young lives of people who have these kinds of sexual attractions before habits have formed, before the lack of any interruption to that flow of thinking. People can change how they think and they can change how they act. It has to be worth a stab, doesn't it? It has to be worth a try, intervening in those young lives. If you can identify that really early on in lives, children are attracted to children and they grow up into adults who are attracted to children. David is called in from Lincoln to carry on our conversation about whether we should take the time to try to understand, and by that I don't mean mollycoddle and feel sorry for, but to understand and get help for, get interventions for adults who are attracted to children. What prompted this conversation is a news story about the increasing prevalence and use of and importation of childlike dolls, sex dolls, being used by people in this country. Should we stop that? Should we make that illegal, the importation of such dolls? And I was prompted by a few calls on James's programme from men saying that they did have an attraction to children, to ask whether we need to take a cooler-headed look at paedophilia. David, how do you see it?
Hiya. Well, what it is, I've just got a quick comment to make. I've got a friend who's got a friend who went into a police station and said, look, I'm having these feelings of attraction towards children, and I'm scared that I'm going to act on them. And the police basically turned around to him and said, look, we can't do anything until a crime's actually been committed. Sorry.
And just sent him home?
Pretty much, yeah. Now, as far as I'm aware, he's not actually acted on his feelings or anything like that, but I just see that as really, really bad. You know, you've got someone who's actually actively going out of the way to look for help before they abuse a child.
Yeah.
But then the people who are there to safeguard the communities are basically just saying, we can't do anything until you actually do abuse that child, until you do harm somebody.
And have you spoken to your friend about it?
I spoke to my friend about it, but I've not spoken to his friend in person myself.
Oh, I see. The person in question isn't your direct friend, I see.
No. It was passed along to me by the grapevine, you know what I mean? But, I mean, I could have met the chap, but whenever I know that my friend was going to meet him, I was like, no, I'm not, you know, I don't want to be around that sort of person. Which I suppose, well, when you look at it like that, it's a shame because, you know, the guy is actually going out to try and get help, but because of who he is, you know...
Maybe he went to the wrong place for help. He should go to his GP for help.
Yeah, but I don't know, because you see your GP quite often. If I had something similar, I wouldn't want to talk to my GP about that, because the moment you tell your GP, every time you go back to that same doctor, they've got this you know, idea about you, which, you know, whether rightfully or wrongfully founded.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is...
regardless of who you go to.
Yeah, but the thing is, David, you've already said, and I completely understand, but you've already said you kind of steer clear of him because you don't want to hang around with people like that. The police said on your way you have to commit an offence before we can get involved. And now you're saying, possibly rightly, perhaps not all GPs would react like this, but plenty would probably. You know, there'd be a discomfort about that person coming into your office to see you in the surgery. Of course there would be. But not addressing it is more dangerous, isn't it? It's sending an unexploded bomb out onto the streets.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. If we don't address the issues, then yeah, that is it's just going to get worse. It's going to exacerbate. But well, I can appreciate what you're saying about going to a GP. A GP would be in the best position to signpost you to the relevant support services. But when you go to the police, you know, I'd imagine the chap's gone to the police because he's genuinely in fear of how close he is towards acting on those feelings.
Yeah, it might be the case. It is. It's a horrible story. David, thank you. Giles has called from New Malden. Hi, Giles.
Hi, Sheila. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. You're not best pleased with this conversation, are you?
I'm not at all. I'm a primary school teacher. I work with young children. I have worked with children who have been abused. I've worked with children who have been neglected, and I've seen the cost of what these things have on the children and their families and the people around them. This kind of behaviour, in my opinion, is absolutely degenerate. Just because you don't act on your feelings, it doesn't mean that you are not accessing pornography. It doesn't mean that you are not acting.
Well, David wasn't it? David, who rang James's programme, was.
Which is a crime. It's a crime.
Yeah, and which he's been convicted of.
Absolutely, but what's next? You know, some people go and look at videos where people harm each other. Some people look at videos where animals are being abused. Just because they're not acting upon that, it doesn't mean that's going to be the norm. I mean, I've got friends in the LGBT community who are really frightened of this conversation. They're frightened that there's going to be a P put on the end of the LGBT acronym, because we're having a much more liberal and soft debate about these things.
Well, hang on. I think, have you listened to this whole hour?
I've listened since James's programme.
Oh, okay, good. Well, you can't imagine for a second that I'm liberal about these things. I'm the opposite of liberal about these things. No, I know, but also I've built a conversation this hour that is not liberal about these things. I started it by saying it is a crime. It is always wrong to abuse a child. It should always come with a very serious punishment. However, understanding is important. And I don't mean tolerance and there. I mean understanding. Knowledge.
That's a very good point. I mean, I don't know how much time, how much money and how much effort is put into serial murderers, serial rapists and what have you. But I'm sure there is quite a lot of time put into those people. I don't know the statistics of those who come out and do not reoffend or turn their lives around in jail or whatever institution they're in.
The thing is, people can have... I think you're right. Of course it's degenerate. But if people can have proclivities, and they can be good people with those proclivities, or they can be bad people with those proclivities, sociopaths, psychopaths, narcissists, whatever. But clearly they can be people who just think, God, I need to get help about this because I do not want to harm a child.
That I agree with you there. I feel this kind of behaviour, these kind of feelings are of a mental nature. It's mental health issues, that's for sure. But what I do feel is these people who are coming onto James's programme, admitting to certain things, I think they're at that point of almost being caught. You know, the people who is, coming on and saying, I haven't acted upon these feelings, but the fact that they're making it apparent is they're so close to being caught, now they want that help. That's my opinion.
Well, by being caught, you mean acting on them?
Absolutely, yes.
No, I thank you for your call, Giles, and thanks to all of you. I mean, we've got another 10, 15 minutes of this, so more of your calls in a moment, but all of your calls have been very thoughtful. Even when emotions are running deep because you yourself were abused as a child, you've been very thoughtful, all of you, when you call, and Giles was no different, a primary school teacher from New Malden. Let's keep this conversation going until 40345 6060 973. Lucy's called from Wimbledon on this question of whether we need to have a different kind of conversation, in a sense, about paedophilia, about people attracted to children. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Sheila. I just wanted to say, I do think LBC and yourselves and James should be commended for bringing this subject up. I understand it's very difficult to talk about, and Gary, wow, what an incredible man, and I can't believe how balanced and amazing he sounds, considering all he's been through.
Absolutely, yeah.
And even the gentleman, sorry, I didn't catch his name, but who phoned James earlier.
David, yeah.
Yes, I mean, what to feel like he should just discuss it, and he's clearly struggling with what he's going through. I mean, it's quite difficult. I have a daughter myself, she's 1, and when this, you might hear her in the back of the car, she's a bit chatty, but when this conversation come up, I always err on the side of caution. I do think that we need to be looking at paedophilia in a slightly different way. I always think with lots of things that trying to understand the problem and listen to these guys who clearly are struggling with how they feel, would lead to a better understanding. The only problem is that sometimes the subject of paedophilia becomes so taboo that you actually can't even have a discussion with someone about it.
Yeah, in the way that the caller David from Lincoln said that he, a friend had told him about another friend, lots of friends in that conversation, but anyway, and he then just didn't want to see that person. He doesn't want to be around this conversation, and I understand that. It is understandable. But the danger of turning these people into the great bogeyman who's different to us and a big threat to us is what's what's allowed so much child abuse to go on, because the great bogeyman isn't the great bogeyman. He's your uncle or your teacher or your scout leader or the priest, or, you know, it's not that simple.
No, and it's true. And I do feel that some of these people, I say guys, it's not always guys, it's men and women, you know, they do need somewhere to go. And I do think that at some point we have to stop saying, well, you know, trying to shut the door before the horse has bolted, and actually try and look at it before we get to a problem. You know, like the gentleman said, you know, the police said we can't do anything until until it's actually happened. You know, that's sad.
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily the police that need to do it, is it? It's other types of professionals before somebody has committed an offence. Lucy, thank you. Lucy in Wimbledon. Sarah's call from Southwark. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. What I really wanted to bring to the conversation is firstly just to thank you guys, because I think this is a really important conversation. It's a very difficult conversation, but it's one that needs to happen in order to make any change. And I just want to sort of clarify that my life was touched. I was abused by a paedophile for 6 years as a child. And I think one of the things that makes the conversation so difficult to have is the word paedophile is associated with a paedophile that's acted upon their urges. So, therefore, somebody that has those feelings, which therefore makes them a paedophile, is put into the same camp. And they may live a torturous life because of those feelings that are innate and they can't help having, but they have to overcome to live in our society, because to act on it is wrong. But to feel it, can we really say it's wrong to feel it? You can't help how you're born, whether you are heterosexual, straight.
I think we can say it's wrong, yeah. In the same way that, I mean, I'm not equating the crimes, but in the same way that, you know, if you have kleptomania and you feel like stealing things from people, yes, you need help, but it doesn't make stealing things any less wrong.
No, exactly, and I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that it's right to abuse a child at all. What I'm saying is that the young person that is getting hormones at 11, 12 or whatever, and starts to notice that they are attracted to other children, and as they age, they start noticing that they're not now attracted to 17-year-olds or 20-year-olds, that they're still attracted to 12-year-olds or younger. At that point, they start to realise, hang about, I'm a paedophile.
Yeah, and that's the time to get help, isn't it? Allow someone to speak up at 15, 16 and say what they're feeling.
It does make them a paedophile to have those feelings. But it's not their, and this sounds awful, but it's not their fault that they've got feelings, but they need help to prevent them abusing another little girl or little boy and putting those children through, you know, for me, you know, I'm into my 40s and I'm still in therapy. I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I'm still trying to readdress the balance in my life because of what happened. And that's true for almost everybody's life that has been touched by a paedophile that way.
I'm sure.
And I just think the conversation with so many people that phoned in that have been abused and raped or whatever by paedophiles, they're upset, they're angry, they don't want to hear the conversation, and I can understand that. But if we had a vocabulary that differentiates between somebody who has that feelings but isn't acting on it and is reaching out for help, and therefore that person was able to get help, because paedophiles wouldn't necessarily go most and talk to a therapist for help. What help is there for them?
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's such a heavily loaded word, isn't it? Rightly, and there's nothing you can do about that. It is
vocabulary on it. Might make the conversation easier.
I also, I wonder. I also believe that there are people, probably mostly men, but people who don't have any neuroscientific reason for being attracted to children. They're just psychopaths.
Hurt people and
who don't care where they get their kicks from. Yeah, you could include Jimmy Savile in that, I think. Yes. You know, they're just, if they want sexual satisfaction, they'll get it any which way they can.
Yeah, and my point isn't to say, let's hug a paedophile, you know, or pour them. No, if an adult has abused a child, they deserve the harshest of sentences, and our justice system doesn't offer that, unfortunately.
No, it doesn't offer that. It offers fairly piddling sentences and on-licence therapy. I've sat in, actually, with 6 paedophiles on 2 therapy sessions years ago as part of my job, and it was incredibly revealing. I won't go into what happened there, but it was just incredibly revealing. And that aspect of therapy is a big part of what goes on these days. I'll just read a couple of texts and tweets before I hand over to Ian Payne. I worry when this is discussed as a sexual preference. Quite a few of you have said that kind of thing. If we don't try to understand, we can't find a remedy. We have to put our horror to one side. Each image viewed is one more act of abuse. We have to help, says Cindy. And Cindy also says, in response to the call that we had from Gary, Gary and I are alike with failing to understand our situations, but to ignore means there will be more like us. And I think that's at the heart of everybody's attempt to understand these things. This particular kind of sexual attraction is to prevent abuse of children, no more than that.